Q&A session, but of course, at the end they will be addressed. So the recording mode is on, and I take this opportunity to welcome uh, Dr. Debashis Bandyopadhyay, who is a professor at the Department of English, Rabindra Bharati University. I am fortunate enough to be his student. I was just telling sir this morning earlier that I'm feeling very nostalgic today because I am going to attend his class after nearly a decade. So before that, I would also introduce him to the audience here. I can see some faculty members joining us as well. Uh, Professor Bandyopadhyay at present is, as I informed, a faculty member at the Department of English, Rabindra Bharati University. Formerly, he worked as a professor in Vidyasagar University and Banaras Hindu University. He was a Fulbright scholar, and as a Fulbright scholar, he taught and researched in California State University, Fresno, California. He was also a Charles Wallace postdoctoral fellow and pursued his research in St. Anthony's College, Oxford University. His research interests include psychoanalytic hermeneutics and identity and post-colonial literature and postmodernism. He is published widely in India and abroad. I would specifically mention his book, Locating the Anglo Indian Self in Ruskin Bond, which is published by Anthem Press. It's a wonderful book, and it has also been shortlisted by Washington Review of Higher Education, USA. But I'm telling you, the scholarship Sir is offering for decades is too vast to be captured in these words. For that, I would hand over the session to Sir right now. So over to you, sir, and thanks again for giving us some time from your very busy schedule. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Debaditto. I'd been knowing Debaditto for quite some time, a very decent guy for that matter. And also thanks to the organization who had hosted my lecture today. It would be a short lecture, not a big one, because I have another assignments. Thank you for the introduction as well. However, it is a compliment after compliment that Debaditto, with all his humbleness, had showered upon me. That is not very important. What is important is I had been teaching for almost 28 years now. So my classroom is the most important space that I value so much. So I miss the offline classes. So virtual classes cannot actually compensate for the offline classes. So this particular lecture would more or less be a sort of an introduction to Passage to India, trying to contextualize A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. Against the kind of literary representation of British literary faculties that were actually being harvesting at that point of time from the entire 19th century onwards to the beginning of the 20th century. So something unique I would be saying, which generally scholars do not refer to, especially the attitude of the British men and women, the colonizers for that matter, the kind of political inconvenience which was not uniform or universal from the beginning of the colonial period to the end of the colonial period. There had been a number of ups and downs that had taken place. There had been a number of swings in attitude taking place according to the political changes that were taking place for the entire 19th century. In that context, we are going to understand or try to understand A Passage to India. But for that matter, let us begin with the title first, A Passage to India. At what point of time E.M. Forster had taken up the onus of writing this novel, and it is a daring novel for that matter. Only 3 novels of the contemporary time are generally inventoried as, to some extent, truthful representation of the Indian scenario, especially the subject races, the colonized people. One is, of course, Rudyard Kipling's Scheme. The other is, of course, E.M. Forster's A Passage to India. Now, the very title of Passage to India, has been taken from a famous 19th century American poet called Walt Whitman. This is known to all of you. And the name of the poem that is embodied, that is incorporated in the anthology called Leaves of Grass, is called Passage to India, without the article A before it. Passage to India. Now, why does E.M. Forster actually use this title of Walt Whitman's poem Passage to India? What is there in that particular poem? If the students haven't read the poem, I've just referred to two very important signifiers within the poem, which has some connection or a major connection to the very title of this particular novel, A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. Forster's novel was published in 1924. However, he had been writing this novel for quite some time. That means the denouement of writing of the novel actually came between 1922 and 1924. But before that, E.M. Forster had actually visited India because one of his students belonged to a princely state called Aoud, who was an Indian called Sayyid Ras Masood. These are stories, biographical details that you all know. So Sayyid Ras Masood had gone to England and got E.M. Forster as his tutor. So he got the knowledge of India from Sayyid Ras Masood and was inspired by Masood. And when Masood returned back to India, E.M. Forster was invited to India to visit the state of Aoud, and he stayed there in two different phases. So all that E.M. Forster is representing in this novel is to some extent garnered or gathered from his own experience of India. However, don't forget that there was a political inconvenience constantly working in shaping the attitude of Forster at this point of time in 1924. Even then, I would say that he was almost very daring in his proposition of writing this novel. Why I am using the term daring, you will soon understand when I contextualize the novel in terms of the literary history of British representation of India through the entire 19th century till the beginning of the 20th century. Again, I am repeating, I am saying that E.M. Forster have had a first-hand impression of India, number one. Number two, he appeared to be quite neutral, appeared seemingly quite neutral, unlike the other representatives of India belonging to the British colonial structure. But at the same time, you cannot completely dispense with the idea that he was not inconvenienced by the political parameters that were working during the colonial setup. So although he wanted to be neutral, he could not be completely neutral, and he had to, because of the fright of censorship, otherwise this particular novel could not have been published in 1924 under the colonial rule. So he actually veiled many things under markers, under symbols, and different kinds of allegories, which are entrenched within the novel itself. So that is the trick that Forster plays in spite of his understanding of India like the back of his hand. But still he could not represent India in the way in which he wanted to do, perhaps. Had it been a sort of a free India, non-colonized India, or a post-colonial India for that matter, post-independence India, his attitude could have been different. So just remember this and try to understand how daring E.M. Forster was. Now let us get back to from the place where we digressed. We spoke about Walt Whitman's Passage to India, a poem. The two markers that I was referring to as the very important signifiers that had immediate inducement or influence upon this particular novel, A Passage to India. When Whitman was writing the poem Passage to India, he was thinking about two very important technological advancements that had started connecting the Eastern world with the Western world. That means the entire world came into a sort of a circular circuit with two very important technological advancements. What are they? One was, of course, the laying of the telegraph line, which underneath the sea, the submarine telegraph line that joined Europe with America. The entire Atlantic Ocean was connected by a submarine telegraph line that joined Europe with America. Number one, the first technological advancement. The second important technological advancement, which completed the circuit in many ways, was the laying of the railway lines that joined the east of the USA with the west of the USA. Now try to imagine the atlas, the map that Walt Whitman was considering at that point of time. If you join Europe with America, crossing the Atlantic Ocean with that telegraph line, which makes communication so easy and so smooth and so fast, then the circuit would be completed, because you have to cross the entire landmass of America from the east coast to the west coast before you can think about the east from the Japanese or the Chinese side. So naturally, the railways made things smoother, even faster on the landmass of America. So these two technological advancements were very important connective tissues that have had major influence upon the notion of communication, or the impossibility of communication, that E.M. Forster had in mind when he considered this particular title, A Passage to India. When you say passage to India, you don't only mean physical passage of a human being going to another place in order to cultivate that place or to connect with that particular place, but you also mean communication in different modes. Now, what Walt Whitman, in his 19th century poem, which was written almost in the middle of the 19th century poem, had envisaged was a sort of a quick electronic communication, or an industrial or a technological communication, which was intended to shrink the world into a short compass, where the East and the West would be connected in such a manner that there would be no hindrance, and that particular world would look like a sort of a shrunk sort of a place where people would know each other like the back of their hands. Such a sort of a smooth, unperturbed, unhindered communication is what Walt Whitman had in mind. That is why E.M. Forster chooses the title Passage to India from Walt Whitman, because he was trying to represent the possibility, and in a postmodern term, I am slash possibility, im slash possibility. Is it a possibility or is it an impossibility? It is something on the interface of possibility and impossibility of communication with the colonized world that is India. Remember, America had won freedom at the time when Walt Whitman was writing his poem, but India had not won freedom. It is still the subject of the British Raj. So naturally, the British always had the onus of proving themselves superior, or they were one up man than the Indians. So that political inconvenience was there. So now you understand the underlying satire or parody in the usage of the title of Walt Whitman's with that of E.M. Forster's Passage to India. He wanted to show that the communication or the possibility of communication is his intention, but then while dealing with the Indian scenario under the British Raj, how impossible that communication actually becomes. Not only the technological advancements, that smooth and shrunk world he could conceptualize, but even the given scenario of India, the old order of communication, because if you know a little bit about the novel itself, you know that at the very beginning of the novel, Aziz, the protagonist of the novel, who is a doctor in Chandrapur, in the hospital of Chandrapur, returns back in the evening to have his dinner with his own friends, Hamidullah and Mahmud Ali. And immediately he gets a call from the superintendent of the hospital, who was Major Calendar, who says that he has to come back to the hospital again. There was no reprieve. And almost in a huff, he says, these British people do not let us off. There is no respite for us. What do they think? They think that we are their servants always under the British rule. That is the beginning of the novel, where we understand the kind of discontent and the kind of non-communication or miscommunication that constantly works because of the political inconvenience between the two people. But what is important is, immediately he accedes to the request or the order of Major Calendar. And Aziz, without completing his dinner, takes his bicycle or wishes to take his bicycle and go to the hospital, which he had left a few moments ago to have his dinner. But he could not take his bicycle. The bicycle tire got flattened and he had to hire a tonga or find out a tonga for that matter. See, these are symbols. I'm just referring to arbitrary references that why there was no taxis, there was no motor cars at that point of time for common people like the Indian subjects for that matter. However, there were people of the elite class who could drive their motor cars at that point of time. For example, the collector of Chandrapur, the district magistrate of Chandrapur could drive their motor cars. Okay, so that was the disadvantage. So he had to hire a tonga, he had to find out a tonga, and even the cycle which he has to drive gets flattened at that point of time. In contradistinction to Walt Whitman's concept of communication by means of railways and by means of telegraph. So from the very beginning, C.E.M. Forster is embodying within the novel markers of miscommunication, which are symbolized by the ineffectuality of communication between the Indians, the Indian masses, or the common Indians, and the British Raj. And this miscommunication, of course, the flattening of the tire of the cycle and the hiring of a tonga, and that too being non-available at that point of time, refers to classical modes and old slow coach modes of transference or communication. Even that communication was not available when it comes to British-India relationship at that point of time, not to think about the technological advanced kind of relationship that you require to understand if you look at the title of the novel. So the satire lies in the fact that how can you readers, how can the people of the world really think of Whitmanesque idea of communication, smooth communication between two parts of the world, if one part of the world remains within the dark ages because of the colonial subjection upon it. This is one very important marker that constantly reminds us when we think about the title of the novel. There are other connotations of the title of the novel. I'm not going into the details of that at this moment because I have to focus my attention upon particular important things in the novel that you require to understand. So I move a little farther on now to contextualize a passage to India in the given history of literary representation of British India from the beginning of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, till 1857, till the Sepoy Mutiny, the British men actually have had a sort of a more intimate or comparatively more intimate relationship with their Indian counterparts till 1857. This was true, and there were different historical materials and archival materials which endorse this particular viewpoint. For example, Lord Ochterlony, who was the governor of Delhi, have had 16 wives in his harem, and all these 16 wives were Indians. This to give you examples of the kind of intimacy that these British people have had with Indians. So to marry an Indian woman by a British man at that point of time, I'm speaking about the first part of the 19th century, was not a prejudice, was not a taboo. That is why he could marry 16 Indian women. And I'm not speaking about paramours, I'm not speaking about liaisons, I'm not speaking about extramarital relationships that were there, but legal married wives were 16. That speaks about the legalized and endorsed form of intimacy that the British had with Indians. But one thing is very important, that is, when the British started coming to India, and colonialism was slowly being very entrenched at the beginning of the 19th century, the British women were not allowed to come to India. Who were the British men who came to India? British men of the age group of 20 to 26 or 19 to 26 were transported to India in shiploads. And these young British people were actually schooled in British public school system, where they learned that India is a place of treasure, India is a place of cornucopia, where you have to go in order to enrich yourself, both in terms of material prospects and also in terms of God's work that you are doing there. You will be enriching yourself by performing the Christian the ordinations that were heaped upon you by Christ, because you're required to civilize that part of the universe. So these two particular ideas were blended together by the kind of richness that India had. For example, if you most of you must have read To His Coy Mistress by the 17th century metaphysical poet Andrew Marvell. Remember that line in To His Coy Mistress, thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find, I by the tide of Humber should complain, if you remember the lines. Now, let me ask you, why does the poet say, way back in the 17th century, colonialism had already begun? And this particular poem was written for the consumption of the common British people, the domestic people of Britain, and especially the womenkind would be reading very lovingly a poem on love, and that too very innocently. And what would they imbibe? What would be their knowledge? Thou by the Indian Ganges sides, the poet lover is telling his beloved, would rubies find, I by the tide of Humber should complain. That means even the distance of 10,000 miles between me, I sitting beside the river Humber, and you beside the river Ganges trying to search rubies would not have mattered to me. I'm not getting into the context of the poem, but the question is, could such precious stones like rubies could be found on the banks of the river Ganges? No. There were no rubies on the banks of the river Ganges. But see the metaphor written or being popularized, being circulated in such innocent, unattractive texts or cultural texts of consumption, like To His Coy Mistress, where the reader, primarily British women and domestic people, consuming these poems, hogging these poems actually with great attraction, will unconsciously imbibe the fact that India is a rich place where rubies are littered on the banks of the river Ganges. So much so that our people going to India to explore India would not actually create any problem for us. Otherwise, think about the disadvantages of colonialism. How could the common British people allow themselves to spend so much time, so much energy, and so much money to explore such a far-flung place like India? Remember, Suez Canal was not being cut by that time in the 17th century. Suez Canal was created towards the end of the 19th century. So coming to India was a really dangerous prospect for that time. You have to go all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope, that means cross the southern tip of Africa, which is known as Cape of Good Hope because it is always infested with tempests, storms, and almost 8 out of 10 ships were supposed to get drowned there. In your reading of the poem Canonization, there were references to that. In your reading of Macbeth, there were references to that. So how could the British domestic people be persuaded to vote for this foreign policy of Britain at that point of time, unless they were meant to understand that, see, our ventures in India would really reap a lot of prospect, would harvest a lot of important material prospects for us. Such a good place India is. India is a place of treasure like this. So I just give you an arbitrary reference of the kind of public school system that taught these young British children or young British people what India could be like and how attractive a prospect of going to India was like at that point of time. So they entered into the civil service of India and landed in Bombay in sheeploads at that point of time. But once they set foot in India, they understood that all that they have learned in their public school curriculum was simply a misnomer. It is completely wrong. India is completely a different place altogether. First of all, we can't understand what India is like. It is nothing of the sort that we knew from our early childhood in the Western world. Besides, all that learning that we have had in the public school system was wrong. But then they could not get back to England anymore after they got disillusioned. And to add to their disillusion, of course, was the tropical diseases. This is very important. India was infested with, because it is a tropical country, India was infested with a number of tropical diseases like cerebral malaria, jaundice, typhoid, cholera, dengue, and so on and so forth. And these British people invariably contacted these diseases, unable to tolerate the humid and very hot plains of India. That was one reason why the hill stations was created at that point of time, because once they contacted a disease like cholera, or once they contacted a disease like jaundice or cerebral malaria, there was no let off for them. There was no going back for them to England. The British were not only cruel to the natives or the Indians, but they were cruel to their own people, because had they been transmigrated to England, if they had contracted the disease and were perishing in India, then they were afraid that that contamination would simply spread as a pandemic in England, and they are not going to import tropical diseases into England. That is why there was no let off for them. There was no going back for them to England. The only way in which they could have some respite or reprieve was to go to the hill stations. That is one reason why the hill stations came up at the beginning of the 19th century. But even in the hill stations, they could not, most of them could not recuperate completely from these diseases, and they died. If you students ever visit a hill station like Darjeeling, or go to Mussoorie or Shimla for that matter, and become adventurous enough to go to the graveyards, you will find that all the graveyards in the hill stations are actually riddled with the graves of the Europeans of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century of the colonial period. Don't you think this is, from the point of view of Ashcroft, a sort of a incorporatization or appropriation of the colonizers within the colonized space? So the British actually were cruel to their own people. Now, let us come back to our context. These young men of the age group of 19 to 26 years, once they came to India and they started suffering within the Indian system and the Indian weather and the tropical climate, they found it very difficult to administer things. More than that, they had that particular sign of subjugation under the administrative rule themselves. They had to work and behave in a particular manner. But this behavior was to some extent relaxed in the first half of the 19th century. That is why it was possible for the British men to marry Indian women and have liaison with Indian women. In many ways, quote unquote, they depraved themselves, according to Queen Victoria, who took over the administration of the East India Company after the 1857 uprising or the 1857 mutiny. She did not understand what her own people were doing in India, that they were depraving themselves. Depravity is not the term that Indians would be using for the British colonizers in the first half of the 19th century. It was a term from the British political system or political parameters that I'm saying. Freud would be very easy or handy to understand how they deprave themselves. In the British public school system or British disciplinarian civil setup, the kind of life that they could not live, they were capable of living in the Indian scenario. So outside that particular civilizational constraint, they found India a space for satisfaction of their libidinal desires. So naturally, they were taught by the British civilized parameters to be depraving themselves. That is why they became promiscuous. Even in the hill stations, they lived promiscuous lives. Another very important factor which induced this proximity, this promiscuousness, or this apparently depraved life of the British people, British men, were the inability of the British women to come to India in the first half of the 19th century. So the British men, in the prime of their youth, from 19 to 26 years, were all alone, and that too under excruciating conditions in the Indian scenario. So, how are they going to manage themselves? They have had their own libidinal desires. So, naturally, without their own women, their own girlfriends, their own family members in India, especially the women folk, they actually chose to have liaisons and have sexual relationships or racial relationships with the Indian women. That culminated into the birth of a very strong Anglo-Indian community. Very important this is. And if I digress a little, just to give you connectors for what I actually want to mean is, this Anglo-Indian community, with a range of their physical complexion from black to white, you will understand, constantly looked upon themselves as more British or more European than they were Indians. But then these particular people almost always acted as a sort of a psychological fright to the British political conscience. Why? Because once the Anglo-Indian community came almost visible in front of the British administration, just a minute, I'm taking the call, I'm coming back. Just a minute.
I would request the audience to kindly bear with us. Unless it was absolutely necessary, I know sir would not have allowed the session to be interrupted. But I think the way he is going about is engaging enough for us to spare a couple of minutes. So please bear with us.
Oh, sorry. The,
It's okay,
this,
sir. It's
this
absolutely
is the
fine.
problem when you actually work from home. Okay, there are a lot of domestic
Yes, sir.
disturbances that
That's
actually take place. Okay, so what I was saying was, this British men satisfied their desire by having liaison with Indian, not only desire, sometimes they actually have had intimate relationship with the Indians. So the British-Indian relationship was to some extent very intimate at that point of time, unless in 1857, slowly a sort of a discontent started working within these particular men, Indian men, and they could not understand that the British were superior to them. If the colonizers and the colonized lived or communicated among themselves on equal terms, and the notion of intimacy or social intimacy or cultural intimacy worked within them, then what would happen? The native would look upon the Britons as similar or almost equivalent to them. So the political inconvenience actually started working at that point of time. You could not look upon the Britons as superior to you. That was the problem. So naturally, they have had to in many ways a sort of a courage and the temerity to revolt and rebel against the British administrative subjugations that were slowly being heaped upon them. So there was a sort of a paradox working at that point of time. On the one hand, you are having social, cultural relationship of an intimate kind because of the British quote-unquote depravity. On the other hand, you are trying to subject the Indians as inferior to you, did not work. So naturally, that actually came to a climax with the 1857 mutiny. Then immediately, one of the reasons, however, I'm not saying that this reason is exclusive, immediately the British administration, especially the Queen Victoria, understood what was happening in India. So he made Indian British relationship a prejudice by law, and at the same time started bringing in British women to India. So things started changing from 1857 onwards. So the relaxed, intimate, social and cultural affair that continued had changed into a drastic attitude towards the Indians in the post 1857 scenario. Now, once the British women started coming to India from 1850s onwards in order to give company to the British men so that they don't fall lure to Indian women or have intimacy with Indian women, the British women started growing a sort of a intrinsic jealousy against the Indian men and the Indian women. Try to understand this from a different point of view. Of course, they knew that our men were being lured by the Indian women, and the Indian men have had almost the same sort of a relationship that our men had. So, in this particular novel, A Passage to India, at the very beginning, you will find that the women, especially the Mrs. Tartan for that matter, Mrs. Callender, and other British women who go or congregate in the party in the British club or the English club, they are more snooty, more condescending towards the Indian masses than their men folk are. Their attitude towards the Indians is much more carping, much more scathing, and much more critical, and much more what they call the subjective, for that matter, than the British men are. So why is this? In the midst of which you require to understand, E.M. Forster is inventing the importation of two women. One is Mrs. Moore and the other is Miss Adela Quested. So all that had been saying about the 19th century scenario between British-Indian relationship will now fall into place. First of all, from 1850s, 1857 onwards, once the British women started coming to India, they slowly understood the cause of depravity of their men, and Indian women have had an equal attraction to their men than they had towards their own men, which caused, added to the political inconvenience, a sort of a subjective jealousy which was linked somehow psychologically with the political inconveniences. So political inconvenience and subjective pathological investments worked in tandem in order to create a sort of a ignominy of the Indian subjects in the eyes of the British women, which was not that entrenched in the British men. Okay, in why I'm referring to this? Because against this context, you require to understand E.M. Forster's sudden importation of two women. One is Mrs. Moore and the other is Adela Quested in this novel. Now you understand how dangerous and how adventurous the proposition of E.M. Forster was. So, given the contemporary British women's attitude to India, can you really think in the 1920s, that you can India can be looked upon completely in a non-political, in a neutral manner by the British women? A very important question. And this question was supposed to be addressed, or was envisaged to be addressed by E.M. Forster when he thought about bringing in these two women, Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore, from England. And immediately when they came to India, the first thing that Adela Quested wanted to see about India was the real India, again, quote unquote, real India. So one is two women coming to India. The second is to see real India. The question that would be addressed throughout the novel, in the construction of the novel, is there a possibility of two British women finding out real India? Number two, is anything called real India exist? Number three, where does real India exist, or what constitutes real India? That is why from the beginning to the end, there was, in the cave scene, there comes a climax about the notion of intimacy between Adela Quested and Aziz, and then it falls off because of the political inconvenience. There were also subjective investments of Adela Quested's as a woman. Her desire for this particular man, Aziz, works very, very delicately in the Aziz Adela Quested relationship. But because of political inconvenience, if you know the plot of the story, Mrs. Moore was sent away when Aziz was impugned before law because he was thought to have actually molested or inflicted sexual assault upon Adela Quested in that particular cave. For this, you require, I'm not speaking about the mature teachers and the scholars over here, those who don't know about the story of Passage to India. I'm just referring to the fact that in the middle, the entire novel is divided into three parts. The first part is called the mosque, the second part is called the cave, and the third part is called the temple. There are, again, a little digression. There are different scholars, especially Edward Said, in both his famous work, Culture on Imperialism and Orientalism, refers to this particular novel as one of the most important and a significant novel to understand the British-Indian or West-East relationship. Even there, he points out that throughout the novel there had been no reference to the rising Indian nationalism with the birth of the Indian Congress. This is another very important conspicuous absence in the novel that E.M. Forster never addresses in the entire novel. What the uprising of Indian nationalism and the resistance against colonialism was all about. And the second important thing that this particular novel does not refer to is the notion of, or the possibility of, the rapprochement between the British-Indian relationship in its exhaustive manner, the intricacies of it. But the second pointer of Edward Said I do not actually buy, because this particular novel is a very apt demonstration of the fact that the testification or the questioning of the notion of intimacy has actually been pointed out. So for those who do not know the plot, let me refer to the fact that Adela Quested, a young woman, had been brought by Mrs. Moore to India with the intention that Adela could be married off to Ronnie Hislop. Ronnie Hislop is the magistrate of Chandrapur. Where is Chandrapur? Chandrapur is actually located in a former province of India called Oudh, which is the western part of Bihar, where actually Sayyid Ras Masood was the prince. That is the state where Sayyid Masood was the prince, and E.M. Forster had come to stay in India. But he cannot actually use Oudh because that would be a historical testament for that matter. So he fictionalizes that particular state of Oudh, one particular place of Oudh, on the banks of the river Ganges, that is on the Gangetic plain, as Chandrapur in this particular book, here, A Passage to India. And then the novel begins with the mosque and it comes to a climax in the cave. Adela Quested, although she had been brought to be married off, or just to find out whether she could have a relationship with Hislop, Ronnie Hislop, that particular tussle or that psychological problem gets problematized, gets aggravated in the course of the entire novel. She is trying to understand the attitudes, the mindset of this man, Ronnie Hislop. Finally, she decides not to marry Ronnie Hislop. But then two men actually were working in the entire horizon of Adela Quested. On the one hand, the politically convenient marriage that she could have with Ronnie Hislop, a British man working as a primary Indian grassroots administrator. On the other hand, a native Indian who is equally educated in foreign education, in Western notions of medical science, called Aziz, who is a doctor. So Major Calendar, who is the superintendent of that particular hospital where Aziz actually works, is no better than Aziz. Both of them are Western educated Indian doctors. But then because of political inconvenience, Major Calendar was superior than Aziz. But then this particular woman, in her intended attempt to find out real India, was becoming closer and closer towards Aziz. She thinks that she is becoming closer and is slowly understanding what real India is. For the sake of the plot, the first intimacy, well, that was intended, but then in a very structured manner, was the bridge party. In the bridge party, Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore were invited in order that they can see real India. In the Bridge Party, the British administration had called all the Babu Indians, and the Babu Indians were made to sit almost in a gallery on the remote periphery of that particular party, whereas the Britons were sitting in the center. And taking a little leeway, Miss Adela Quested goes to meet with these Indians, with Mr. and Mrs. Bhattacharya. But then she could not understand the exotic or presumptive behavior of these two persons, Mr. and Mrs. Bhattacharya. Because just as it was politically inconvenient for the British to meet intimately with the Indians at that point of time, it was the Indians, even the Babus, who knew their rights. They have to behave in a particular manner within the structured conditions of British political communications. So Mrs. Bhattacharya and Mr. Bhattacharya does not behave in the right way. So Adela Quested's first attempt to see real India come a cropper. She failed to do that. On the other hand, Mrs. Moore had actually seen a part of real India when she, at that particular night, takes her way out from the garden party, from the English club, and moves towards the railway station and finally comes to the mosque and, to her surprise, discovers Aziz. So when you read the novel, it is not possible to exhaustively analyze the novel over here in this way. I'm just giving you markers and pointers to think. Mrs. Moore, although she was not intent to find out real India in the way Miss Adela Quested wanted to find real India, constantly thinking about real India, real India, real India, which itself is a myth, real India. It is impossible to see real India without seeing their Indians or understanding the Indians. That is what Cyril Fielding points out in a passing gesture. If you want to see real India, see their Indians. It is pregnant with meaning, but none of these characters understand what it means. So in spite of Adela Quested, a young woman, a callow woman for that matters, intention, what is this intention, real India? This particular idea that she envisaged of finding out real India is also a myth that was embedded within her because of the kind of education that she received in England at that point of time, real India. So in her mind, the real India could be that prosperous real India, that classical real India, that have had a cornucopia of treasure in the Indian soul. So that real India was actually working in her mind. Whereas Mrs. Moore, an elderly lady, does not have that sort of an embedded notion of real India. She goes out of her actual customary behavior and goes out without thinking of anything into that mosque and discovers real India to some extent, which Adela Quested cannot do at the beginning. Just a marker which you have to remember and think, what does this actually mean? The difference in ages and the difference in attitudes of these two women. So what Forster is doing, although she is bringing two women in the context of the inordinateness and the impossibility of British women's what they call the friendly bonhomie with the Indians in such an impossible political context, he is bringing two British women to understand what real India is. But these two women do not have a customary, conventional, general idea of India. Even between them, there is a difference. The elderly woman looks upon India in a different way from the young woman. There was no homogeneous uniformity about that. He is actually endorsing the notion of diversity in British attitude. But how long does he do that, T.M. Forster? In their attempt to find out a diverse notion of India and an actual notion of India, political inconvenience comes as a sort of a hindrance. That is why in the cave scene, how does the cave scene actually come into being? How does it come into an acme? How does it work, the cave scene? The cave scene works because in the bridge party and later on in a tea party, Cyril Fielding, do you know the story? The students especially. That is why if you don't know the story, it becomes difficult for you to tell you all the plot and continue with it. But anyway, let me continue. In the tea party, Aziz, Cyril Fielding, Mrs. Moore, and Adela Quested join together to make and Aziz out of goes out of his way to actually entertain these particular new women. And he says that I will take you to Marabar Caves. Aziz himself had not visited Marabar Caves for that matter. So they fix up a date on which they go to the Marabar Caves. Cyril Fielding cannot join because he is late. The train from Chandrapur leaves at the right time, and Aziz was almost alone with the guide and the two women, Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested. In the Marabar Caves, which is unlike anything that these two women had ever seen, it was a claustrophobic, dark, damp inside of the caves, which Mrs. Moore at the very beginning could not actually accept. And something of a dark, damp thud works on her temple. And she says, "What is that?" And she becomes scary and goes out of that particular cave and finally finds that it was the hand of a little child. Then Mrs. Moore leaves. Leaves means does not follow Aziz and Adela Quested. Adela Quested and Aziz were left alone to visit the other dark caves themselves. And in one point of time, Adela Quested asks Aziz how many wives he has. I cannot go on telling the details about the entire story. And to ask this question to a Mohammedan, to a Muslim man, was a sort of a indecent gesture, which Adela Quested, because of her immaturity, did not know, because she did not know the cultural nitty-gritties of India. Aziz also misunderstood this woman and moves into a half, becomes enraged, and leaves this woman alone and goes inside another cave. And this woman thinks that this is a sort of a bad behavior on the part of this man and moves into another cave. And finally, there was a sort of a break of relationship between them. This woman returns back to Chandrapur with one of her friends and immediately tells the police that she had been molested, or Aziz had tried to inflict sexual violence upon her. And she threw her field glasses on Aziz in order to save herself. And Aziz finds these field glasses broken on the rocks and carries it with him innocently, not understanding why Adela Quested had left. Even there is a pathological investment in this particular woman's framing Aziz for what Aziz had not done. There also lies a psychoanalytic interpretation of that. If you have read Yeats's famous poem Leader and the Swan, you will understand why is this. A rape, which is a violence, can actually change into a sort of an acceptance. This particular woman, Adela Quested, who was simply toying her relationship between Aziz, which cannot be endorsed and become explicit because of political inconvenience, whereas her relationship with Ronnie Hislop could be explicitly mentioned, requests now to be hidden under the trope or under the different symbolic markers of her intended desire for Aziz. And a psychoanalytical reading of the cave scene, which is not possible at this moment within the next 2 or 3 minutes to do. But then if you think about it, you can have an answer for yourself, but you require a sort of a psychoanalytic initiation to understand it, that this particular woman imagined that she is an object of sexual attraction to this educated Indian man, Aziz. Okay, the same thing that the Indian women have had for the British men. Now, this British woman is having for the Indian man. So when Aziz leaves that particular company of Adela Quested in a half, this woman becomes immediately enraged because her ego was hurt for 2 reasons. One is that how dare this particular man who is a slave, who is a native, and who is supposed to be politically inferior than we are, could really dare to behave like this with me. Number one. Number two, I am normally an object of attraction for this man. It was an imagined suspension of disbelief about this particular man. How cannot I be an object of desire for this man? Did you get my point? She had started thinking egotistically that as much as I get attracted by Aziz, I remember in psychosexuality, it is not physical sexuality we are speaking of. We are speaking about psychic notions of sexuality, which is connected with the entire libidinal energies, which has different kinds of manifestations for that matter. So she wanted to be an object of desire for this particular man. But why Aziz behaved in that manner? Because his cultural and religious sensibilities were hurt by this question, how many wives have you, was misunderstandable by this particular woman, which are also very important elements of the miscommunications, misrecognizations that actually work in terms of communication between the British and the Indians at that point of time, because it is impossible for the British, or it was inordinate for the British, to understand the real Indian cultural and social setup. And Adela Quested has been shown to be demonstrating that particular misrecognition or miscommunication in every particular movement and act of hers. So, out of this pathology, why you are politically inferior and you can behave like this with me. Number one. Number two, how cannot I be an object of attraction for you that you can behave like this with me? So, she immediately, this pathology worked out or manifested in the form of her coercive and pathological framing of this man to the police once he returned back to Chandrapur, saying that he wanted to rape me, which is a very customary indictment that the British women or the other would actually do because of political convenience. And all the men, with Ronnie Hislop included, actually became exalted by this particular framing, and they got a sort of a issue to go against Aziz. Aziz was also a very important object of jealousy for Ronnie Hislop, and Ronnie Hislop made complete use of this particular framing of this woman. But finally, she understands what had happened to her when that particular emotional moment dies out, and she finally exonerates this man from being jailed. But in the meantime, Mrs. Moore, although she thought that this particular man could not do anything of that sort, but she was not prepared because of political inconvenience to give a test to act as a witness of what actually happened in the cave. And in the meantime, Ronnie Hislop transported her back to England, and on her way, Mrs. Moore died out. This is also a very important symbolic marker. That means anybody who wants to be sympathetic towards the Indian or wishes to have a different attitude towards the Indians, wants to come closer towards the notion of real India, is a political inconvenience under the British rule. That is why a woman like Mrs. Moore had to die in the process of the narrative of the story. And Adela Quested, without understanding what real India is, being shocked and hysteric of what the darkness of the cave is all about, and returns back to England to marry a different sort of a person who is a Briton. Okay, this is how the entire story continues. Edward Said also points out, along with the notions of nationalism and the notions of communication that we had actually referred to, another very important difficulty that this particular novel shows from Adela Quist, from Said's point of view, is India's classical civilization, that India was really a civil society with all its great heritage, had not yet been underlined by E.M. Forster in this novel. The novel comes to its climax in the cave scene, where the reality of India cannot actually be explored, is something that had been proved and demonstrated by both these two women, Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested's hysteric shock. But does India actually reside in the cave, in that darkness? Is that particular darkness is all that India has? This is a very important question that Edward Said raises. But I have a rejoinder. I want to say that this particular darkness is symbolic darkness, referring to the kind of depth that India has, the kind of psychic what you call complexities that India have, and the difficulty to unearth real India that is not possible for the British women to adjust. So both Edward Said and Edward Said's commentary upon this particular novel And this particular idea of the cave being simply a symbol, or the darkness which requests to be plunged to understand real India, which is not possible for either Aziz to do or for the British to do, is also acts as a sort of a myth or a symbol. Both these work hand in hand together. But the notion of communication with which we actually began, it's almost time, I will be ending now, well, comes to an end. If you, the end of the novel is the temple. So Aziz, after the cave scene, after the indictment, and after his exoneration, uh, both Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested leave that particular scene. They go away. One dies on the way back to England. The other returns back, not to return back to India anymore. And her desire to find out real India remains unsatisfied and never to be fulfilled ever. After all this happens, Aziz goes to the Hindu city of Mao and becomes the physician of the prince or the king of Mao. This is how the story was ends. But then the last word of that actually works, or the last conversation between Fielding and Aziz, was that Aziz says that the true friendship between the Indians and the British will never be possible under the British rule unless India wins freedom within the trope of colonization. However intimate the relationship Aziz and Fielding must have had between them, there were possibilities of misunderstanding between them that had actually taken place in the relationship of Aziz and Fielding, because he thought that Fielding is going off to England in order to marry Adela Quested, the very woman who had indicted her wrongly. How could my friend Fielding have had such a could actually betray me like this? This is again a misunderstanding, because Fielding does not go back to marry Adela Quested, but goes back to marry another woman, another lady who is the child, who is the daughter of Mrs. Moore from a second marriage. And once he returns back with his married wife, and Aziz comes to know what had actually happened, the rapprochement between Aziz and Fielding takes place. But then that rapprochement does not end with a very confident note that this rapprochement would continue without any hesitation or without any further problematic hindering their relationship. It does not end with that. It ends with Aziz's final commentary, and if you consider to some extent Aziz to be the spokesperson of E.M. Forster, the last word is, unless India wins freedom and British colonialism ends, there can be no true friendship between the British and the Indians. So the elements of friendship that had worked between Aziz and Fielding, the elements of friendship that had worked between Aziz and Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore had all come a cropper. However, the positive direction or the positive note is there is a potential or a possibility of Fielding and Aziz to continue holding a relationship even after India wins freedom. And that intimacy was could have been stronger after that. There was also a possibility of Mrs. Moore and Aziz holding a good relationship if the entire story had taken place in a post-colonial setup. There was also a possibility of this woman, Adela Quested, looking upon Aziz as a would-be husband or a would-be partner had the political convenience been capable of providing this particular scenario. So now you understand, I could not actually do justice to the entire novel. I tried to contextualize this particular novel in the British-Indian relationship that continued for a long period of time from the 19th century to the 20th century. Why these two women become the major two characters in the novel? Because the British women's attitude towards the Indians from a psychosocial point of view request to be adjudged, and also from a political point of view request to be adjudged. And finally, how daring E.M. Forster was to invent this proposition and this hypothesis tasting in the entire novel. What was the hypothesis then? The hypothesis was, is it possible to have intimate relationship with India under the British rule. Yes is a null hypothesis. No is a research hypothesis. So yes, the null hypothesis becomes wrong, and no becomes right. The research hypothesis becomes right. These two women had been brought from England to demonstrate or come to an empirical truth about the endorsement of the research hypothesis, how true it is. And that is why the last note of these two characters work. There are other very important intrigues and psycho-political effects within that particular novel, which requires an in-depth study of the novel. And there are different markers within the novel, which in a 1 hour lecture cannot be done. So I perhaps what I tried to do is to make you understand the possibility of communication between the British and the Indians. Number two, the representational tactics that worked at that point of time, and the literary history of British representation of India, in the context of which this particular novel requests to be adjudged, and how explorative and how non-customary, non-conventional this novel is, given the kind of customary relationship that the British representations of India at that point of time actually held. Okay, so I'll be stopping here. Debaditya, it is now open
Yes, sir.
for 1 or 2 questions if you want to like.
Yes, I request the audience to kindly be precise with their questions, because as you can see, sir has already spoken for more than an hour. So students, and with sir's permission, keeping the brevity of time span that we have, I would also request the students, তোমরা যদি মনে করো যে একটু তাড়াতাড়ি বলতে পারবে তাহলে বাংলাতেও প্রশ্নটা করতে পারো,
হ্যাঁ,
কোনো অসুবিধা
বাংলাতেও
নেই।
করতে পারো, যেমন ইচ্ছা তোমাদের, সবাই করতে পারো, স্টুডেন্টস এবং অন্যরা যারা
Yes, I
আছেন।
can see some faculty members and
স্যার
colleagues. Okay, আনজারুল কিছু বলছেন। হ্যাঁ,
স্যার অ্যাডেলা এবং আজিজ কি পরবর্তী তার দেখা হয়েছিল তাদের?
Adela এবং Aziz. As
Yes,
far
sir.
as the novel is concerned, no, narrative of the novel নেই।
ঠিক আছে।
What is
okay, we have 2 questions in the chat box, and I'm reading them out.
বলো।
What is the meaning of the ending of A Passage to India? I think sir has spent a long time on that. Why does Dr. Aziz reject Henry Fielding's offer of friendship?
Henry Fielding, Cyril
It's not Henry Fielding, yes.
Cyril Fielding.
Is friendship possible across the racial national divide? And I think I should add Prosenjit Sarkar, who is our student, question along with that. A Passage to India নভেলের সাথে কি কোনো মুভমেন্ট, আমার মনে হয় প্রসেনজিৎ আমাদের অ্যান্টি কলোনিয়াল মুভমেন্টের কথা বলছে স্যার, কোনো সম্পর্ক রয়েছে কিনা এটি প্রসেনজিৎ জানতে চেয়েছে।
হ্যাঁ, 3টে কোয়েশ্চেন একত্রেই আমি বলছি। এক হচ্ছে, the way the novel ends clearly tells us from Aziz's point of view that and this is a recognition, and this is the enlightenment that we actually get, a post-colonial enlightenment, that given the political inconvenience, the subject race cannot have an intimate relationship with the ruling race. So the colonized relationship, the self-other relationship, is bound to continue within the binary of a political divide until the political imbroglio ends. This is the note with which that particular novel ends. The self-other divide would continue everlastingly. So if we consider the context of the novel, from the beginning of the 19th century, the notion of intimacy continued until the political scenario comes to an head with 1857. So if we trace the British-Indian relationship from the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century onwards, you will find that the more stringent the political skirmishes and enmities and the British material interests in India and their separate objectives from the Indian objectives continued and took different kinds of shapes, the more the intimacy started breaking up. So, if we understand the novel from a broader historical context, the loss of the intimacy, the slow, gradual evolution of British Indian relationship towards the negative dimension until 1947 was something against which the last Aziz's contemplation, Aziz's endorsement had actually been referred to. আরেকটা কি বলছিলে যে anti-colonial movement. Of course, it is an anti-colonial novel. If we look upon from a post-colonial interpretation of the novel, Aziz's basic statement that if the East have to meet with the West, given the Walt Whitman's concept of the possibility of fast communication and the shrinking of the world, there would be no divide between the East and the West. If this has to be possible, then the world has to be completely rid of all forms of colonialism. Colonialism or its different 20th century or 21st century imperial avatars, or neo-colonialism for that matter, should not work. And there should work an egalitarian relationship between the two races in terms of their material interests and in terms of their emotional interests to have any bonhomie possible. So, of course, nothing can be a more sharper anti-colonial commentary than that. This entire novel is a testification on an exercise of the possibility of intimacy within a colonial rubric and how an anti-colonial message is developed or demonstrated through the narrative of the text. Of course, it is an anti-colonial novel. However, according to Syed, one of the most important anti-colonial movement, that is nationalism, had been to some extent surpassed or left out by E.M. Forster. Perhaps E.M. Forster did not want to enter into the nationalistic discourse or the nationalistic, intricacies at that point of time. Okay.
Okay, sir, we have a question from Murshedda. Murshedda is a faculty member at Gaur Mahavidyalaya.
Okay.
Murshedda seeks a clarification whether there is a clear indication in the text that Adela desired for Aziz and charged him of molestation because he rejected or left her alone in the cave.
Right.
And then we have Doipayan's question. Doipayan also happens to be a faculty member at a college affiliated to Vidyasagar University. Doipayan asks about the significance of Goldbolles' song, Come, Come. And Sabana's question, I think, has already been answered. She asked about the message of A Passage to India. And Anarul Hussain once again has asked whether there is any relation with a true event that Passage to India has.
Right.
Okay, so I would request the audience to limit their questions because I know sir has a very tight schedule today. So over to you, sir, again.
Okay. I take the last question first. As for any particular event, there is a particular event that actually E.M. Forster refers to in his letters about his relationship with Said Ras Masood, but there had been a number of events, several events of this particular note, that was inducement for E.M. Forster's understanding of these particular two characters. However, the invention of the two characters, Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested, was very originary on the part of E.M. Forster. There were no such characters of these two kinds explicitly drawn from historical evidences as such. However, there were many British women who have had a sort of a sympathetic notion about the Indian masses. Not all British women belonging to the political echelons or the administrative side have had this sort of a condescending attitude towards the Indians. However, the average British women's attitude was of that particular kind. Okay, that is why Aziz, there is a satire of this particular notion of Aziz's notion about the British women as well. In page 36 of my book, which is a Penguin edition, at the dinner, at the very beginning of the novel, at the time of dinner, Aziz is having a conversation with Mahmud Ali and Hamidullah. Aziz says, Granted the exceptions, he agreed that all English women are haughty and venal. Aziz's this commentary is a third-person commentary that E.M. Forster is making without making Aziz conscious about what he is saying. Aziz is also getting a sort of a prejudicial, customary attitude towards the British women, as much as the British women have had towards the Indians. So Aziz's conception of the British women's attitude towards the Indians is also born out of the political inconvenience that he was witnessing from his entire career of life. But there were exceptional characters. Like, for example, one of the wives of Lord Ochterlony, Miss Beard, English counterpart, English wife of Ochterlony, called Mrs. Beard Ochterlony, actually created a lot of non-government organizational, meted out non-governmental organization helps towards the Indian women. The Indian women were rehabilitated, many, irrespective of religion, many Islam, Mohammedan, Muslim, and Hindu and Jain women were rehabilitated by this Mrs. Beard Ochterlony. There were multiple examples of British altruism, British women's altruism towards the Indians. But the average British attitude towards the Indians, especially the women's attitude towards the Indians, have had this sort of a condescending attitude. So I would not say that there was any particular episode from which this particular two characters of Moore and Adela Quested were drawn or portrayed, but there were several references that E.M. Forster actually read, because the reference to Ochterlony was there in E.M. Forster's letters and communications with Said Ras Masood. That he have had between 1911 and 1912, which is enough endorsement of the fact that he knew about the different characters of these particular British people in India. The first question was, what was the first question?
Yes, sir. Murshedda was seeking a clarification whether there is a clear indication in the text about Adela desiring Aziz.
See, when you read a particular text psychoanalytically, the particular references that the lines, the narrative discourse makes, you can read just opposite to that particular discourses. If you read the cave scene, I have to search out those particular lines. I remember there are particular lines in the cave scene where Adela was thinking Ronnie Hislop at the very moment when this particular discontent takes place and this particular episode of molestation, or the envisaged imaginary episode of molestation takes place. This woman was thinking about her would-be marriage with Ronnie Hislop. And then suddenly she focuses her attention upon Aziz and thinks about her immediate context, that she is now with Aziz. And the third-person commentator, that means the authorial commentator at that point of time, takes it upon himself to underline, quote-unquote underline, emphatically, that although Adela is thinking about Aziz and is making these comments to Aziz, she is doing that entirely from an objective point of view, without any subjective investment. Why does the commentator, a third-person narrator, required to intervene within the novel to make this particular thing clear, quote-unquote clear, which is not clear at all, clear to the readers? Why should, I think this is a paratextual intervention on the part of the authorial narrator. If Forster had not made this particular comments there, that she does not have any subjective investment in Aziz, it would have been better for us to understand through the kind of conversations that they were having and the kind of mindset that Adela Quested was having at that point of time. But given the question, one question after another, you will understand that two particular scenes, not everything can actually be written down by linguistic markers. Even there are narrative markers, which are plot markers, where incidents are placed one after another as symbolic means for which you can understand or deconstruct a particular text. not only linguistic markers are helpful for understanding things. The very moment that she veers her attention from the marital notions of Ronnie Hislop to Aziz, and then finally gets into that koladol, that kawadol, where she wants to rise up, is enough proof of the fact that she was having that particular notion of marriage or the notion of relationship toying in her mind, either with Ronnie Hislop or with any other man, whoever it is, whether it is convenient for her to marry. And in almost all the cases, we find that Ronnie Hislop is not the right partner for her, whereas Aziz is actually helping her around, and Aziz had already gained a sort of a good attention from Mrs. Moore, and Mrs. Moore have had a sort of a good opinion about Aziz, and so has Adela Quested grown a sort of a good opinion of Aziz. Otherwise, she would not have acceded to the Aziz's request, this particular gesture of coming to this particular Marabar caves. And the darkness of the caves actually had brought things out. Now, try to understand the contrast between Mrs. Moore's understanding and Adela Quested's understanding. Mrs. Moore, the same particular happening had same particular incident had happened with Mrs. Moore a little while ago. Mrs. Moore, Adela, and Aziz had gone into a cave together, in the dark cave where nobody could see each other. And Mrs. Moore was disturbed by a damp, swarthy thing touching a particular part of her body, which Mrs. Moore does not immediately infer as Aziz's attempted molestation towards her. Okay, now you can ask this question that Mrs. Moore is an elderly woman and Aziz could not have touched her. That is the crux of the point. If Mrs. Moore thinks that I am an elderly woman and nobody would touch me, and I am understandable enough to finally find out that it was this soft hand of a little child, one of the natives who had gone into that particular cave, then Adela Quested could also have had the rationale to find it out in the same manner. The thing is working within Adela Quested's mind that I am an object of attention, object of attraction, which my mother-like figure, Mrs. Moore, is perhaps not. So the very attitude of Mrs. Moore, of the same attitude, of the same or the kind of responses to the same sort of an incident for Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested, makes many implicit things understandable for us. Otherwise, what you require is to read the lines from a psychoanalytic point of view. If I had any more time, I could have read the lines to find it out what the author is intending to say. He's saying just the opposite of it. That is exactly what psychoanalytic reading actually do. One pointer, of course, I was making was that when the third person intervention takes place forcefully, it becomes a paratext which is at odds with the general discourse that is continuing there, which perhaps tells us that, come on, readers, don't think that Aziz is an object of attraction of Adela. E.M. Forster is taking the pains to do that. Why? It is almost like the Bible saying, love thy neighbor as thyself, because it is impossible. Okay, it requires a more deeper reading for that matter, but especially when you compare Mrs. Moore and Adela Quested's responses to the same situation, you will understand that. And the third person intervention is very significant over there. You have to read those particular lines once more and think in terms of what I actually said. However, I had not made it a confident analysis. I'm not persuading to believe in the fact that Aziz and Adela, or at least Adela have had that sort of intimacy with Aziz. Adela was simply imagining that being an Indian man and an educated man for that matter, and we are British women, we are obviously objects of attraction for these men. Otherwise, how could Aziz really go out of his way to become so intimate towards me? When Mrs. Moore had gone away, how could Aziz think about going alone with me to these caves. Okay, this was perhaps unconsciously thought of by Aziz and Adela Quested together. And the incident takes place not as long as Mrs. Moore was there. Once Moore was away, and Mrs. Moore's response had towards the same sort of an incident had already been narrated, then Adela Quested makes this response. These are some things, pointers that you require to keep in mind. You can write a paper on that. This particular question, is there any genuine marker, genuine device which tells us that Adela Quested have had an attraction for Aziz? You can write a paper on that with these particular markers. It is not possible to go exhaustively there. Murshid, or whoever had raised this question.
Yes, Murshidda had raised the question.
Murshid, could I answer a part of it?
Murshidda, could you please respond if you are here? Okay, I think he has either left the meet or he is experiencing technical difficulties.
Might be. Okay.
Okay, sir. And since this is going to be published in YouTube subsequently, I think he would eventually find your answer, even if he was not there at the moment.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so now we have Doipayan's question, but sir, I know we have.
This is the last question. Okay, because it's almost.
Yes, Doipayan. Yes, sir. Doipayan has asked about the significance of Goldbolles' song, "Come Come."
Okay. There are a lot of treatises, a lot of scholarship that had worked on Narayan Goldbolles' particular song. Goldbolle is actually making a satire of the notion of intimacy, the same thing. The very song or the discourse of the song Come Come actually speaks about it. But at the same time, the song is a sort of a plot intriga, you can say, as sort of in aspects of the novel. Here Forster refers to the notion of the plot intriga, something that actually holds the reader's attention or sustains the reader's attention together. First of all, it makes a satire of the notion of intimacy. The second is, of course, that it actually sustains the reader towards what is going to come next, what is going to happen next. Because Narayan Goldbolle is like Fielding, is just a counterpart of Fielding, the Indian counterpart of Fielding, although their attitudes were the same. But then Narayan Goldbolle is an Indian Brahmin, whereas Cyril Fielding is a British. So naturally, this particular song satirizes and at the same time creates an Indian obverse of, yes, of course, Professor Bandyopadhyay, thanks for you. Okay, thank you, Murshid. So it's just an obverse of Cyril Fielding's notion of the Indians. Okay, but with a satiric undertone in it, and also a plot intriga from the Forster's point of view, which sustains what is going to come next. What is going to come?
Okay, so now we move to the very last section of this lecture. I wish I could go on giving a comprehensive overview of the wide range of references, pointers that sir has offered, but keeping the time span in mind, I would only add this. Blake said that we can actually see eternity in an hour. Well, we have not for sure done that literally, but I think the wide vistas that Professor Bandyopadhyay has so kindly introduced us to is remarkable. It has shown us the remarkability of a remarkable text in a remarkable manner. So thank you, sir. Thank you wholeheartedly for this. We look forward to inviting you in person to our institution in future. Have a very good day. Have a very good weekend.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Debaditto, and all those who have had a patient hearing of all that I said. I could not do justice.
Thank you, sir.
Bhalo theko, in the pandemic situation. Asha kori সবাই নিজেদের ক্যারিয়ার আরো স্ট্রেংথেন করবে এবং ভবিষ্যতে তোমাদের খুব ভালো হবে। থ্যাংক ইউ দেবাদিত্য, উই মিট अगेन, আবার ফিরে আসবো।
নিশ্চয়ই স্যার, নিশ্চয়ই।
ওকে, বাই বাই।
বাই স্যার। আচ্ছা, আমাদের স্টুডেন্টসরা, আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, আমি তোমাদেরকে গ্রুপে একটা মেসেজ করছি, তোমরা একটু দেখে নিও। ঠিক আছে, বাকিদেরকে বলছি একটু আস্তে আস্তে ছেড়ে যেতে। আমি